I've often quoted as saying I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston telephone directory than by the 2,000 people on the faculty of Harvard University.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
They share our beliefs, our convictions, our hopes, and our dreams. These are the conservatives of the heart. They are our people.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny and James. Today we are joined by Dr. Daniel Mahoney, a professor at Assumption College, senior fellow at the Real Clear Foundation, and contributing editor to Law and Liberty. Dr. Mahoney is also on the academic advisory board of the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation. He's got a long history with ISI, having been a faculty member and mentor at numerous ISI honors conferences. He edited our Solzhenitsyn reader, has written a book for us on Bertrand de Jouvenel, and much more. Dan, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Johnny.
So, Dan, this week for our listener question, Emily asks, how can conservative thinkers outside the U.S. help us to understand American conservatism and how it is distinct from and similar to European or British or other types of conservatism?
Yeah, I think American conservatives make a big mistake when they opt for what you might call intellectual and spiritual autarky. I'll give you an example. I noticed self-sufficiency. I noticed for a long time that while American conservatives in principle and rhetoric were defenders of Western civilization, they didn't know much about contemporary Europe. And they simply associated contemporary Europe with various forms of intellectual pathology that are to be avoided or bad political practice, which is to be lamented. There's some truth to that, but I think some of the most interesting and penetrating and important currents of conservative thought today come from outside the United States. And I don't have in mind some of the more eccentric traditionalist currents. Matthew Rose has a book coming out about that from Yale in August. But someone like Roger Scruton in Britain, who is our most philosophically minded and yet civically accessible, not only critic of the culture of repudiation, as he famously called it, but he has done as terrific a job of articulating a theme for today: what Western civilization is, what territorial democracy is, why our civic and moral heritage is worth preserving. And some of the French thinkers that I know well, Pierre Menant and others, Alain Bessasson, who have they've been confronting a form of some mixture of Marx and Nietzsche, of postmodern nihilism, really going back to the 40s and 50s, and certainly culminating in 68 with the events that nearly toppled the Fifth Republic. So, we have this odd situation today where the French and others are screaming about an American contagion, but they seem to forget the American contagion is a French and continental contagion that came to the American universities and now has been reimported into places like France. And so the most penetrating critics and the best informed critics of, you might say, the intellectual virus or the pathologies that confront us today are European, because they have a longer experience confronting these various forms of moral, political, and intellectual nihilism. So, it is true that we have a distinctive civic tradition, but a conservative, like my friends at Claremont, who want to reduce everything to the American founding, I think they make a mistake. The American founding is the core of our civic experience, and it needs to be thoughtfully engaged and defended, and very much so at the present moment. But, even the American founding draws on a civilizational inheritance that is broader than itself. So, for all those reasons, I think we need to be thoughtful American patriots, conserving our own inheritance, but we also need to understand that inheritance is broader and deeper than our civic tradition itself.
Dan, beyond Roger Scruton, who I would obviously highly recommend, and we'll talk more about today, are there any contemporary European philosophers or even contemporary European publications or journals or websites that you might recommend our students check out if they want to get more plugged into what's being discussed and debated over there?
Yeah, I think one of the best Anglophone journals, which is pretty new, is The Critic, which is it's I would say a good cross section of conservative and classical liberal thought, dealing with culture and politics and contemporary events. Clearly, very anti-politically correct and anti-woke, but at the same time having a deeper intellectual edge. Little reminds me a little bit of the old Encounter magazine, which was a great English monthly for many, many years. In France, yeah, there's some interesting new journals. There's a journal, Valeurs Actuelles. That's not new, but it's a weekly that has a broad conservative orientation. There's a sort of interesting, a little more right wing than I am, but not over the edge, called Incorrect, INCORRECT. Obviously, we don't pronounce it that way. That comes from politically incorrect. There's another journal whose name is escaping me, a monthly edited by Elizabeth Lev. But yes, there are some good. There are good conservative journals in France today that are they're really taking an aim at what I would call self-loathing. W.B. Yeats' great remark, very relevant remark: "Come fix your eye upon me, I thirst for accusation." Well, the Europeans were ahead of us for many decades in self-flagellation and self-loathing, like somehow Europe, the freest, and most tolerant and humane portion of humanity, was somehow uniquely guilty or culpable of unprecedented sins. But of course, that spirit has invaded the United States with a vengeance. So,
and now we're sending it. Now we're sending it back. We're exporting it back to them, and we're accelerating their madness.
Yeah, I think this summer or fall, I'm going to write an article on that dialectic. The European invasion and then the American reconquest of Europe, but it is amazing when the French Minister of Culture says, "Stay away from this American stuff." I did an interview with Laure Manville, who is a great editorialist for Le Figaro, a couple weeks ago, and she said, yes, all the French politicians forget to mention that these were originally French ideas. The French call it the pensée de 68, the thought of 68. And it's Foucault, Derrida, but also Sartre. Sartre was a good novelist and a fine writer, but he wrote a book called Critique of Dialectical Reason, where he defended fraternité terreur, fraternity terror. The only way human beings found true community was in acts of collective violence. That's how they could overcome their separateness. And as Remi said at the time, there's a lot of fascism in that, the cult of violence at the service of communist politics. The same man who said in 1952, when he returned from the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union he wrote this in Liberation, any magazine called Liberation is a journal of the left. He said that the Soviet Union was so free they had no need for bourgeois forms like elections. So, no, the madness has been there for a long time, but we've added the racialist component. The Manichaeanism isn't class Manichaeanism so much. It's part of the, class, race, gender thing, but it's this insane racialization of the whole of human life. Although some of that came from Frantz Fanon, who wrote a book in the early 60s calling for colonial peoples to murder white people. And I think it was Susan Sontag, an American in the 60s, who said the white race is the cancer of humanity.
Sounds like a lecture I think I read about at Yale a couple weeks ago that I think Rod Dreher wrote about.
Oh
Um,
yeah, oh yeah, just terrible stuff. Yeah.
yeah. Well, thanks for answering the question, Dan, and also for posing the question, Emily. And for our listeners in the future, if you'd like to submit a question for the next episode, just leave a review of the show wherever you're listening and put a question in there, and we'll pick one for the next episode.
So, Dan, for our next segment, we'll do our books of the week. So we'll start with you. What are you reading right now?
Well, I've been taking a peek at this new book by Jason Riley called, well, it's a book on Thomas Sowell. I can't remember the title.
It's called Maverick, right?
Maverick. It's a bit light. I mean, it's not a terribly demanding book, but it's a lovely overview of Sowell's life and major writings, themes, and his remarkable intellectual courage. So I would recommend, it's very important, I think, for somebody like Sowell to get his due. I'm also reading this book called Minds Wide Shut, How the Fundamentalisms Divide Us. You might think that's an assault on Protestant fundamentalism, but the fundamentalism, Gary Saul Morson, the great Russianist, and Morton Schapiro, the head of President Northwestern, mainly have in mind the woke, pointing out how this is a new secular religion, deeply destructive of real philosophy, real culture, real civic debate. I think it's a very important book. It's measured, but it's published by Princeton. It's not a screed, but it's a very important critique of what's going on out there in the intellectual world.
What about you, James?
Yeah, so I just started in on Orestes Bronson's The American Republic. So I've been sort of on a Lawler kick recently, which has pushed me toward his introduction to the ISI edition of the American Republic, and now I'm just getting into the actual text, which has been great so far. I'm only 25 pages in or so, but it's good to be reading something a little more thick than just the sort of the books they're coming out in the conservative movement and whatnot. But getting back to the
American Republic is a very great book.
Yeah.
It's a distinctive conservative and Christian defense of the American Republic, and one that I think is much needed. Peter Lawler, by the way, was one of my best friends. We collaborated on many projects together. Good to be on a Peter Lawler kick.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I seem to be running into a lot of Lawler's friends recently, James Patterson and Richard Reinsch and you and others who are just sort of pushing me toward him and saying you need to read this. So that's been very good. It's been very good.
Yeah, good.
What about you, Johnny?
I'm working my way through a collection of essays that was published under a new book called Red, White, and Black, Rescuing American History from Revisionists and Race Hustlers. So this is a project of Robert Woodson at 1776 Unites. And it's basically a collection of essays that include John McWhorter, Clarence Page, Shelby Steele, Carol Swain, and others, taking on the kind of the intersection of race and the 1619 Project. So yeah, it's by and large, I think, been very informative, very well presented. And I also saw that it made when it first came out, I think it actually was at the #1 spot on new releases on Amazon, which is very impressive to see that it getting that kind of traction. So eager to continue making my way through it.
I just ordered that book.
Oh, nice. Okay, great.
Well, yeah, those are the best independent-minded Black thinkers in the country, and they're all over the place. But what they have in common is a deep resistance to the new racialism and political correctness, and really good fellows.
Definitely. Well, moving on to the main course, so to speak, Roger Scruton, who I have fond memories of because he was my college graduation speaker back in 2012 at Hillsdale. And then we did a lot of work with Roger when I was at the American Conservative. He was our New Urbanism Fellow. He wrote a cover story for us called A Writer Shade of Green that was making a case for a conservative vision for conservation. And spoke at a number of our events. And I also spoke at an ISI event, and we'll play that recording in a little bit. But before we dive into the clip. I was just wondering, Dan, if you could tell us a little bit more about who Roger Scruton was and who were some of the influential thinkers that really shaped his thought.
Yes. Well, I believe Roger was born in 1945 in a working class family. In his memoir, Gentle Regrets, he describes his father as a somewhat resentful working class guy who, disliked the dominant classes and had a bit of an edge to his thought and politics. But and Roger had a complicated relationship. But Roger benefited from English education when before the classics were de-emphasized, before the sort of regnant ideological approaches became dominant. Probably the last generation that got a classical education in what we would call public schools. Of course, he went to Cambridge, got a PhD in philosophy. His initial interests were not political ones, and Johnny has already mentioned some of them. His early work was on architecture and music. He was always a defender of high culture and of taste and decorum, and a concern for the public common good in his approach to architecture. And those remained major themes. And you're absolutely right. Later on, he wrote a book, a kind of manifesto, a very learned book on a kind of conservative green approach. He certainly defended markets and localism and opposed the sort of globalist, centralized approach to ecological issues. But he certainly thought conservation was a preeminent conservative value. But anyways, as Roger has written in Gentle Regrets, his memoir, and in other places, he was in Paris in May 1968, to bring things back to what we mentioned earlier, and he was appalled by the insouciance, as he called it, of these bourgeois student rebels who were, praising Mao and Castro and Trotsky, who were, remember the motto of May. You guys won't remember because you're too young, but the motto of May 1968 was "S'interdit d'interdire." It is forbidden to forbid. So this radical, emancipatory, antinomian, liberationist, no rules, no authority, no ability to distinguish between authority and authoritarianism on the one hand, with foolish admiration for the most totalitarian regimes in human history that were very far away. So that was the beginning of in the good sense, the politicization of Roger Scruton. Roger writes in one of the opening chapters of Gentle Regrets about his admiration for Charles de Gaulle, who represented a certain idea of France and French patriotism in continuity with civilization. And it was at this time he discovered Edmund Burke and began to see and appreciate the great enduring relevance of Reflections on the Revolution in France. Burke is the critic of ideological thinking in the modern world. Roger was also influenced by Kant and Hegel, not the Hegel who influenced Marx, but the Hegel of the philosophy of right, who defended the Rechtsstaat, the law state, and Kant, the idea of the human person. Although he wasn't simply a Kantian, but he thought that he really believed that moral things were not reducible to anything other than themselves, and he thought there was an irreducible dignity to the human person that was not reducible to anything other than self. And Kant is an important influence there, not in politics so much, but in philosophy. And he also regularly evoked the Platonic idea of care of the soul, that philosophy and just good living are about the cultivation of the human soul, a very traditional idea that we have almost forgotten. Roger had what he called an apprenticeship in atheism. He was a cultural conservative, but not a religious believer. but he in the 90s he started coming back to a Christian affirmation. The last chapter of Gentle Regrets is called Returning to Religion, and he worshipped in a Anglican parish. He wrote 3 books on theology near the end of his life: The Face of God, The Soul of the World, and also a book called Our Church on the Church of England, which he loved, but he saw was in mortal illness, or it was suffering from deep pathologies. There's some people in England who say, oh, Roger was just a British cultural conservative to the Anglican Church that smells and bells. But my friend Mark Dooley wrote a great piece at the Critic last year saying, no, Roger really became a bit of an idiosyncratic, but he became a Christian of conviction. And so this idea that his Christianity was merely cultural is silly. He had his cultural Christianity when he was still an atheist. When he became a Christian, his Christianity was no longer cultural, although he liked the cultural dimensions of Anglicanism. I should mention 2 other things about Roger. He was 3 things. He was the most forceful, eloquent, and wise critic, going back to the 70s, of what he called the culture of repudiation. He saw sometimes he called it the hysteria of repudiation, this mad desire to repudiate our inheritance. It's in fact been going on for 50 years and it's been moving along rather expeditiously, but I think we've noticed it a lot more the last year and a half because it's become a political movement of grave import. He was also, along with Pierre Menat, the most eloquent defender of the nation. Not nationalism, but what he called humane national loyalty. All democracy is territorial democracy, a phrase actually going back to Orestes Brownson. See, it all connects. And this idea of global sovereignty, that a people needs a home, and national loyalty is a very circumscribed form of loyalty. You're loyal to your fellow citizens. So your relationship is not primarily tribal, creedal, or sectarian. Now, Roger certainly believed that the territorial democracies of the West had an important religious component, but the primary form of political identification was loyalty to the country, not loyalty to a particular creed or loyalty to a particular tribe. And most of history, creedal and tribal loyalty, one reason why, like our newfangled plans to democratize the Middle East didn't work out is in some sense countries like Iraq aren't real. The first thing to know is, are you Shia, are you Sunni, are you Christian, etc. The tribal loyalties, Saddam Hussein's entire inner circle came from Tikrit. These were all. I knew we were doomed in Iraq when a famous anthropologist told me that 90% of Iraqis were married to their first cousins. Okay, that's tribal. So anyway, and one last thing. Roger was a great anti-totalitarian thinker. Some people know that he was part of an effort to bring to aid the intellectual underground mainly in the Czech Republic, but also in Hungary, in Poland, and even in the much more draconianly controlled Romania. And that project, the Jan Hus Educational Fund, that brought in speakers to speak to underground seminars and universities, that snuck in publications, that Roger himself was arrested in 1985 in Czechoslovakia and deported to the border. Barbara just said about Jacques Derrida, who did go to Prague as part of this effort and got arrested, that Derrida getting arrested was the best thing that had ever happened to him, because he came back to Paris and he said, there really is a difference between the freedom in France and what exists on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And right before he died, and that clip we all watched of Roger, the 11 or 12-minute clip speaking about civilization. I know we're going to talk about that. Roger, he's already, you could see he's a little afraid. He's dying of cancer, essentially. But within 2 or 3 months, there were ceremony. He flew to Prague. He received the highest medal from the Czech government. He spoke in perfect Czech to the Czech Senate. And then in December, he was honored by the president of Hungary and the president of Poland in ceremonies in London. So I think from the architecture and music and conservation to the anti-totalitarianism, the critique of the culture of repudiation. Of course, he wrote operas. He was very interested in music. A posthumous book has been published on Parsifal of Wagner. So, well, that gets it all out there.
This is one of the things I was really interested in while I was sort of preparing for this episode and thinking about Scruton. Is he was, one of the few conservatives that was alive when I was alive, who was sort of what I might call a humane conservative, right? Who has a mind for arts and letters and music and architecture and all these different things. And is not just solely focused on politics, because I think a lot of popular conservatives today that a lot of young people are reading are just sort of only really looking at politics. And it seems to me some of that probably came from what you were saying is sort of Roger's younger study. And I believe his dissertation at Cambridge was done on aesthetics and culture or something like this. Is that right?
That's right.
And how do you think that shaped the way that he ended up thinking about philosophy and politics, that he had this sort of humane side?
Yeah, he was not, to add, he was not an apolitical or anti-political thinker. He wasn't like one of these cultural conservatives who say, politics doesn't matter. Roger was a political fighter, and he knew politics mattered very much. But he also, even in the Thatcher years, he esteemed Thatcher, but he thought her focus was too economistic. She certainly saw through communism in a very impressive way. But, he wanted to remind conservatives that we were defending a view of the human person and a view of civilization that was very capacious and very open. Not open to everything, but open. And not just a particular civilization, our civilization, that Spenglerian or Huntingtonian view. We're all in these closed civilizations and never shall meet. He saw the West as this generous, open, and yet specific civilization, but one more than any other open to universality or defined by the meaning of the universal and the particular. So, yeah, I do think, he was a philosopher of great note. Maybe the professional philosophers don't want to admit that, some of them at least, but he was an outstanding philosopher. I think it's too low to call him a public intellectual, but he liked to be called a man of letters because he was a man of letters. He was a humanist. I think in the ISI lecture, he speaks about being proud of, teaching the humanities. And he thought it was awfully crucial to pass that on to young people. He reminds me, there's this famous remark of Vogelin saying, the world can be going to hell, but none of us have to be agents of the ideologists. We don't have to go along with this. We don't have to sell our souls. And Roger had that very simple notion that we could care for our souls and the souls of others in a way where we kept alive civilization despite the political discontents of our time. So, I think he got the balance right. But he was certainly I don't know a man who was, to use a fancy word, had a more capacious range, he was interested in everything, but he was never a dilettante. He was a man of serious erudition and judgment. Beauty, for example, he did a TV series in 2008, 2009 on beauty, but he defended a very countercultural position, just happens to be the true one, that not only is there right action and right judgment, but there is right feeling and right appreciation of beauty. That doesn't mean there isn't an element of taste in our preferences for certain things, but it means that beauty is simply not in the eye of the beholder, that beauty reflects something about the nature and structure of reality. And, And the fact, in his little book on beauty, it's more of a popular book, but he brings together high philosophy, discussions of art with culture criticism. And he does it in a very, I like the phrase, high-minded, Roger could be a polemicist, but he was never low or vulgar. He was always elevated in the sense that he saw things from the heights without losing a sense of the urgent, what needed to be done, what needed to be defended. So I think he was just a very great man for all those reasons, and not least of which his courage. At the end of his life, he came under systematic assault from the left. In the dialogues with Roger Scruton, the conversations that Mark Dooley, the Irish philosopher, did with them. This came out in 2016, and they're sort of celebrating, all the times of trouble when I was persecuted, and they kept me out of this and kept me out of this and persecuted the Salisbury Review. It's all behind us. And yet a couple of years later, that journalist at the New Statesman, doctoring the interviews, tries to make Roger into a racist, anti-Semite. I mean, he was the biggest offender of Israel in the world, but never mind. And it wasn't for Douglas Murray discovering the original tapes and publishing them and forcing an apology from the New Statesman. And of course, the Tory government, showing no courage, fired him in a half a second on the basis of these mendacious reports. And something very rare happened in the age of political correctness. The government issued an apology and restored him to his position. So being honored at the end of his life, especially by the Central Europeans he loved, and winning that battle in Britain against the woke, here he was dying of cancer, but he went out in a blaze of glory. He was very contented by those victories. And he was for him, gratitude was the highest of the virtues. It's not on Aristotle's list, but it's unofficially on the list. That the gratitude was the proper response of the human person to the gift of creation. And he was very grateful. He was grateful to God. He was grateful to his friends. He was grateful for the tens of thousands of letters he received from around the world when he was under assault. So it's almost as everything came together providentially, because it could have ended in a moment of grave defeat, and it didn't.
Well, on that note, let's move forward to play the clip that Roger Scruton recorded for us towards the end of his life when ISI gave him the Defender of Western Civilization award. But before we start that clip, I just like to thank everyone for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission at ISI is to educate for liberty. So if you'd like to help us pursue that mission, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, let's get on to our recording of Roger Scruton.
It is a great honour to be named Defender of Western Civilization for the year 2019 by ISI, an organisation with which I've been connected for a long time and whose work seems to me to be ever more important and ever more necessary, not just for young people, but also for us, the older generation, who are trying to communicate the things that we know. Western civilization has come in for a lot of attack because it's Western. The word Western has been taken to be a standard term of abuse by so many people in the world today, and in particular by people who don't have the faintest idea what it means historically, metaphysically, or poetically. Our Western civilization is not some peculiar, narrow little obsession of people who happen to live in a certain geographical part of the world. It is an inheritance, constantly expanding, constantly including new things, something which has given us the knowledge of the human heart, which has enabled us to produce not just our wonderful economies and the wonderful ways of living in the world that are ours, but also the great works of art, the religions, the systems of law and government, all the other things which make it actually possible for us to recognize that we live in this world, insofar as possible, successfully. Let's leave aside the idea of Western civilization. After all, it depends which way you're going around the globe, whether it's west or east. Look instead at the idea of civilization. What is it? What is a civilization? It is surely a form of connection between people, a way in which people understand not just their languages, their customs, their forms of behaviour, but the way in which they connect to each other, eye to eye, face to face, in the day-to-day life which they share. This is something which has ordinary dimensions of in the workplace and in the community, in our day-to-day making do with things, but also it has a high culture built upon it, works of art, literature, music, architecture and so on, ways of changing the world so as to be more at home in it. And I think that is the distinctive feature of Western civilization, that it is a comprehensive civilization, constantly giving us new ways of being at home, ways of being in relation to each other, which bring peace and interest as the primary bonds between our neighbours. Now, I myself have obviously got into an awful lot of trouble through defending Western civilization, and it seems a strange feature of our times that the more you are disposed to defend it, the more you are regarded as some kind of narrow-minded bigot. But the people who make that accusation are the real ones with the narrow mind. They're people who do not see exactly how large and comprehensive our civilization has been and still is. We were brought up on, for example, the Hebrew Bible, an ancient document which perpetuates the civilization of the pre-classical Middle East, gives us a sense of what people are like in tribal communities when wandering through deserts and so on. We learned and studied the great epics of Rome and Greece, which taught us different languages, dead languages, but languages which showed the world in a different light from our own languages today. We were brought up again on the literature of the Middle Ages, much of it influenced by Arabian literature, of course. Indeed, we all were put to bed with bedtime stories from the Arabian Nights. The further you look into it, the more comprehensive and universal do you see the inheritance of our civilization to be. And that is something that we tend to forget today. It isn't a narrow bequest. It is something which actually is open to all kinds of innovation, which accepts the whole of human being as its subject matter. Certainly that is the way I have looked at it. I've always rejoiced in being a teacher of the humanities, because I recognise that humanities is what it's about. It's about being human and all the many ways in which that way of being is diversified and comprehensive in the world in which we are today. Whatever we do, we must fight back against this accusation that somehow our civilization is narrow, dogmatic, bigoted, exclusive. It is not so. Compare it with what, after all? Compare it with the Chinese? Are we narrow, bigoted and exclusive when set beside the great Confucian tradition? Not at all. I was brought up, like many others, with an interest in the Chinese civilization. We read the Confucian Odes in Ezra Pound's translation. All of us fell in love with Mahler's Das Lied von der Erde, one of the greatest settings of Chinese poetry in all music, certainly greater than anything I've heard in Chinese music. And there you are, there's a bigoted remark, but let's recognise it's not bigotry at all. It's a proof of the open-minded and generous aspect of our culture, that a composer like Mahler could extend his romantic Viennese emotions in the direction of those lonely poems that he set to such beautiful music, leaving us at the end of the last of them with that incredible chord which, as Benjamin Britten described, stays printed on the air. Why are we now being forced into a defensive position when it's so obviously the case to anybody who knows anything about it that what we call Western civilization is another name for civilization as such, and for all the achievements of civilization that young people need to know about and, if possible, to acquire. The problem, it seems to me, stems largely from the invasion of the academic and intellectual world by activist groups who do not take the trouble to learn enough to know what they're up against, but nevertheless define their position in terms of political agendas. These political agendas are all about belonging together in a salvationist group. You know, we save ourselves because we believe the right things, and we're looking everywhere for those poisonous presences which are trying to exclude us from possession of our rightful heritage. And all the new causes are chosen on these grounds. They're causes of people who want to feel that the existing order of things excludes them, and therefore they are justified in overthrowing that order in order to give themselves a place at the top of it. And being at the top, they then will rearrange it so as to purify it of all those old and corrupting influences which have so far have had too much of a deal. Now, I think this invasion of political activism into universities and into the humanities and into all the channels of civilization is one of the great disasters of our age. But it didn't have to occur. We don't have to listen to these people. We don't have to engage in the show trials, the letters of denunciation, or the ways in which people have been witch hunted and driven from the community. It's only because we join in that these activists have any success. We don't have to join in. It's quite possible to stand back and even to laugh at some of the things that are being said. If you look at all the frenzy about transgender activism and so on, much of this is sheer confusion, and confusion that people want to be rescued from. Much of their anger is a kind of call to be rescued, to stay calm and say that, you know, there are other views than yours. You may have a point, but it's not the only point. Let's get down and discuss it. Let's see it in the context of the whole of civilization and where it's going. To do that would be enough to diffuse a great amount of the tension that has been afflicting us. And I feel that now is the time, and through institutions like ISI especially, to bring courage and conviction again to young people who know that there's something wrong with this activist witch hunting of the old curriculum. The time has come, it seems to me, for people like me and the older generation of teachers to give courage to young people, to say that, look, you have a civilization, an inheritance, which helps you to understand these things. Giving way to activism of this kind, activism which excludes whole realms of human knowledge, is not doing yourself a favour. It's not bringing to you the things that you actually need in the world into which you're going to progress. What you need to do is engage in dialogue, which is what civilization is about. Try to understand the human condition in all its complexity. And when people try to radicalize and politicize the curriculum and what is taught and thought about in universities, you don't have to go along with this. You can even laugh at them. It still actually is legally permitted to laugh at people in our country and in our civilization. And after all, comedy is one of the great gifts of civilization, and it's up to you, I think, to exercise it. So my concluding message is that we shouldn't despair of Western civilization. It's just that we should be careful to recognize that we're not talking about some narrow, small-minded thing called Western. We're talking about an open, generous, and creative thing called civilization.
Before we move on to our next question, I just wanted to give you a brief message from a friend of ISI, the Conservative Minds podcast. What does it mean to call yourself a conservative? Where did the conservative movement come from, and where is it going? In a time of ideological realignment and uncertainty where social media sniping replaces measured discourse and debate, people are left to wonder, which values and ideas define American conservatism? On the Conservative Minds podcast, join Corey Astle and Kyle Salmon as they answer these questions and more by reading political authors from the past and present and discussing them in a fast-paced, free-flowing conversation. To listen, go to conservativeminds.fireside.fm or find it on your regular podcast provider. All right, let's get back to the interview. So let's just start by asking then, Dan, what stands out to you as someone who's thought deeply about Scruton's thought and is working on a book on Scruton and Menot? What stands out to you from that clip?
Well, the French have an expression, tout y est, T-O-U-T, then Y, then E-S-T. All is there. And it really is amazing in those 11 or 12 minutes that all of Roger's themes are there, but in a very heartfelt way. I was struck by a lot of things. I won't start at the beginning, but the way he spoke about the obligation of people like himself to pass on the humanities, rightly understood, not this perversion of the humanities, Princeton without Latin and Greek in the classics department. That's not the humanities. That's ideology on steroids. But Roger, I think if Roger had hope, it's that he knew that the experience he had of the enlarging, liberating, humanizing encounter with the best that has been thought and said, with civilization itself, that was available to young people who opened themselves up to it with the help of teachers. Of course, he's a very rare teacher, but those of us who admire his approach, his model of intellectual integrity, can certainly take him as an inspiration. So that sense he has of duty, it's very Burkean, passing, the social contract that connects the dead, the living, and the yet to be born, against that, reductive present-mindedness of almost everyone. That really struck me. And I know I had spent a lot of time with a collection of his essays called Confessions of a Heretic. And in one of those pieces, he says a lot of liberal learning today is going to occur on the edge of the universities. It's not going to occur. And he explicitly mentions ISI in that book. So I think, his highlighting of, his work over the years with ISI was quite sincere. And he thought these kinds of exercises in preserving civilized reflection, civilized life, free politics were very, very important. He saw them as the living reproach of the culture of repudiation. I think the main theme of the talk is, and I think it's so brilliant, it's so important. Roger he was getting this Western Civ Prize. He was a great and learned, erudite, partisan and spirited partisan of Western civilization. But the way he reminds us that at the heart of Western civilization is civilization itself. The civitas, the city, the urbane virtues, the life of the mind, the possibility of conversation, the pursuit of truth, the love, the love of the transcendentals, the true, the good, the beautiful, instead of us being a beleaguered few defending our own, I think yes, we are defending our home. And that idea of home, which also comes out in the conversation, is very, very important for Roger. He always criticized oikophobia, the people who hate home, who want everything to be global and diffuse, and therefore nothing. But he always understood that the home that we defend is a home that's open to the best that's been thought and said, that is open to being renewed, it's open from things outside itself. My friend Remi Brague, one of the good guys in France, a Catholic philosopher, theologian, man of letters, he wrote a book called he wrote a book on Europe called Eccentric Culture, where he says, in a way, Rome in the West was defined by an openness to the best outside itself. Bringing in Greek wisdom, bringing in Hebrew wisdom, bringing in Christianity. And I think that's really true. I mean, the Muslims are actively discouraged from reading the Old and New Testaments. Everything they need to know about Jesus, who didn't die on the cross, and all of that is in the Quran. But this openness to what's outside, but it's not this modern faux openness. We got to be openness to transgendered and to cross-dressing. We got to be open to every antinomian assault on the moral law. No, it's a civilized openness. It's a high-minded openness. So I thought that was a very important moment in the lecture where he's reminding us that this is not just love of its own, although our own is worth loving, our home is worth loving, but there are universal virtues and values that are integral to our home that makes our civilization a uniquely generous and universal one. Now, again, this has nothing to do with the kind of universalism that says, let's bring Jeffersonian democracy to Liberia. We see where that goes. But it's a cultural and philosophical universalism that nonetheless has a profound sense of home.
Yeah. So one question I might ask in response to that, I have a couple questions you've just brought to mind for me. But one is, this is something that I definitely see ISI students struggling with. They think about they're trying to think about how to deal with whether it's people on the left they disagree with or people on the right they even disagree with. Sometimes they feel like they have to sort of draw a line and restrict that openness in such a way, which I think sometimes they actually draw it too far back, right? And they're not they're unwilling to, as Roger says in the video, sit down and parse it out and have a discussion about it and diffuse the tension. Instead, they just sort of draw these lines, and it's not this high-minded openness. It's just closed off. It's just being closed off to new ideas or to challenging ideas. Because really, I mean, I think there is some in some sense, it's very real that a challenged mind is a stronger mind, and is and so how do you distinguish, I guess, between those?
Well, I think everything you said is true, but I would add a cautionary note. You can't, as Vogel said, you can't really have discussions with hard-edged ideologies. So, critical race theory, when people's starting point is that, as Josh Mitchell points out in a brilliant book, The American Awakening, if your starting point is all evil is in certain groups, the transgressors, white males, heterosexuals, etc., and everyone else is an innocent victim of an evil system, there's not civil dialogue is impossible. We have to go at that stuff, and friendships with people who are accusing you of being a beast are probably not possible. But I agree with you. Young people sometimes do. For example, I'm not sure. I think conservatives ought to try to cultivate liberals who share our nervousness about. There aren't many of them, but there are some of them, our nervousness about the assault on free speech, or the nervousness about wokeness. And even on religious questions, I mean, there can be fruitful dialogues between believers and non-believers. And so becoming too narrow, too sectarian, I always, a term like the conservative movement is inescapable, but it kind of has dangers in it, because we don't want to just be a movement at war. We want to be, and by the way, the movement part of it is real. You got to rally the forces, and you'd be utopian and silly to think that's not part of it. But the high-minded part, the cultivation of not always talking about what was. I by the way, I watch Tucker every night. But I don't think the intellectual conservatism is centered around Tucker Carlson. So I like Tucker because he's a fighter, and he is extremely, he's willing to criticize and highlight stuff that we ought to know about. But it's sort of a cliche, but people say, yeah, conservatism used to mean Bill Buckley, and now it means Sean Hannity, and there's some truth to that, I think. that it's not the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And if you read the New Criterion, or if you read Modern Age, or the Climate Review books, you see some really high level thought that is engaging the public square. So I just think part of it's young people. Look, they're under assault. Do not. I come from the academy. Do not underestimate the fear factor. So when young conservatives get together with other people where they can breathe and freely, I think their natural inclination is to feel protected, and some of that is welcome because it frees people up to speak, and some certain well springs in their soul come to the forefront. So it's complicated. I know it's a big issue for you because you're working with young people all the time.
Yeah, I work with a lot of young conservatives and a lot of young faculty members, because in my role I'm working mostly with faculty and graduate students. And as I reach out to young conservative faculty, I've been actually very struck by the fear that they have. Obviously, their livelihood is on the line in a way that a student's livelihood is not necessarily on the line.
Very, 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 very difficult for all conservative faculty, but particularly for the young. And we're in a catch-22 because we obviously want defenders of something like Scruton's vision, or simply defenders of common sense and the American tradition, to go into teaching. But A, it's going to be very hard for them to get jobs, and B, it's going to be very hard not to live not by lies. What a situation where academics feel like they have to hold back their real convictions, where they're afraid of being brought up on charges. We cannot exaggerate how bleak the situation is in the educational world.
Yeah, and that's one thing that Scruton talked about in the clip was the ability to laugh at silly arguments and at confusion, which struck me because I cannot imagine that it would go over well for me if a liberal friend of mine or someone on Twitter, said something ridiculous and I just laughed at them. I can't imagine that would, actually breed good dialogue.
Well, but if you're having conversations with people who think there are 153 genders, as I said before, the common ground, the commitment to the logos, the faith of the directness of the mind to truth, the idea that there's some natural order that we refer to, it's not there. So, yeah. I mean, obviously, if you have friends who are on the left and you want to preserve those friendships, it's not a good idea. But I would not seek out dialogues with people who think there are 153 genders, or who think that whole classes of human beings are guilty not because of what they've done, because of who they are.
Yeah,
as the communists did, the Nazis did, and now the woke do. Because again, there's no shared first principles. There's no confidence in common reason and common humanity. So we have to be very careful. We certainly want to approach things in a spirit of civility with people of goodwill, but when you're fighting, ideologists, people are openly assaulting reason and common humanity and the very possibility of a commonwealth, then I think you got to have a different approach. And Roger, I think, was right when he said, transgenderism. Burke would call it metaphysical madness. It's so stupid. It's so contra naturam that I think it's a little bit of the Emperor's New Clothes situation. You've just got to say, I think it was Mario, Lopez, the guy on the Hollywood Access, Saved by the Bell. The first time Scruton and Mario Lopez have ever been brought together. But he gave an interview with Candace Owens, and he said, quite wisely, if your 3-year-old says, I'm really a girl, probably best not to pay too much attention to it. And 3 days later, he was making this abject apology, Maoist self-criticism, what Drew Brees had to do, when he talked about his father and grandfather fighting for their country and him wanting to respect the flag and what it stood for and the national anthem. I'm sure he still means every bit of that, but he came out like he had, spent 2 weeks under KGB torture and, was again. So dialogue, yes, but you got to know who is a partner in dialogue.
Yeah, I agree with that. I certainly wouldn't want to say that I don't think it's possible that we can, ideologues are called ideologues for a reason. They are unremitting and dogmatic, right? So it is really difficult, if not impossible, in all situations to have a conversation with an ideologue. But I do love the way that Scruton talks about not only just the laughing piece, but the piece about where he talks about like diffusing the tension in the situation by saying like, let's discuss this, let's break it down, and where those opportunities are possible.
Both.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I agree. So let me just get to our for our last question for today, which this is every guest we have on or every thinker that we talk about on the podcast, we ask this question. And so for Scruton, what was conservatism?
Yeah, well, he wrote a couple books on conservatism in the early 80s, a book called The Meaning of Conservatism. One of his vast last books, which I reviewed for the CRB, was called Conservatism, an Invitation to the Tradition. A very fine book. I don't think it's easy to give a 2 or 3 sentence answer to that question, but I can say this. Scruton thought that part of conservatism goes all the way back to Aristotle and Plato. So it was the discovery of philosophy, of self-government, of the highest possibilities of the soul, the care of the soul. Conservatism, in a more specific sense, was a modern movement. And conservatism, in the more specific sense, was a response to one thing. Conservatism is it's not stand-patism. So, Walter Kerr had an essay in the 70s. He says, the press will refer to the Stalinists in the Soviet Politburo as the conservatives. It just, it's meaningless. But Roger thought that the best conservatism was he's English in this way, it's not a defense of the old regime. I'll quote Nietzsche, a figure not normally quoted by conservatives, although he has something to teach conservatives. Whisper to the conservatives, only a crab can crawl backwards. You can't just go back. And the old regime wasn't always so admirable, So Roger thought conservatism was a dissent from dogmatic liberalism. Conservatives of his stripe did not reject constitutionalism and the rule of law, but they raised critical questions and more about mass democracy. They did not deny a certain truth to human equality, but they oppose relativism in culture and morality. They affirmed common humanity, but not some universal homogeneous state that thought humanity could take form through global sovereignty. On and on. So conservatism was that. It's not that conservatism is just a species of liberalism, but much of what is specific about conservatism rose in opposition to the excesses of liberalism. And some of those excesses are rooted in liberal theory. It's individualism, it's materialism, the state of nature, the social contract, the denial that we are naturally political and social animals, or as Burke says in the Reflections, religious animals too. I mean, and conservatism might be summed up from a Scruton point of view as a defense of the idea that while liberty is all important, it's liberty for human beings who are political, social, and religious animals. And Scruton thought that conservatism had something to do with the defense of the free economy, but in that kind of Wilhelm Röpkean way where you cultivate the moral preconditions of the market, and that's largely been forgotten from conservative defenses of the market. It has to be a moral defense. It has to be a defense that, and it sees the limits of economism, that human beings should never. Two things: we're not simply Homo economicus, and we can't simply bring everything to market. Prostitution, drugs, sex change operations. There are limits to what we ought to be able to choose in the market, even if the market is very effective in allowing us to choose what is choice worthy. Those were all, and anti-totalitarianism. I think he thought that it was a lot easier for conservatives to oppose communism, for example, because liberals were torn. There were honest anti-communist liberals. I could name a lot of them, but Sidney Hook and others. But most liberals, Harry Hopkins, the principal advisor to FDR, who may or may not have been a Soviet spy, according to the archives, or an agent of influence, as they call them. He called the Soviet Union under Stalin the New Deal in a hurry. Yeah. And by the way, as Solzhenitsyn points out in the Gulag Archipelago, what did the Soviet leadership and propagandists call communism? The progressive doctrine. So there was a shared affirmation of perpetual progress. Leo Strauss, the German-American political philosopher, said the worst thing that happened to our thought and our discourse under conditions of late modernity is we replace the primordial and enduring distinction between good and evil with the destructive ideological distinction between progress and reaction. But just to say that, you can see why there were so many political pilgrims, so many left liberals, beginning with Tom Paine, who went to pay his homage to the French Revolution, because this was progress. I'm not saying all liberals, left liberals, were pro-communist, but an awful lot of them were. And they were moral equivalence guys, because they saw progress at work. You got to what did Walter Duranty, the man who denied the collectivization of famine in Russian Ukraine, he said, you got to break some eggs to make an omelet. I think conservatives are much more hesitant to say we got to kill people to bring about the utopian omelet. Anyway, I think those give you a good sense. Also, Roger wrote a lot about the Islamic threat. He knew the Islamic world very well. He read Arabic. He had some great respect for Islamic piety, but he thought Islamism as a movement trying to base political allegiance on a rather fanatical understanding of religious law was a grave threat, not only to our secular institutions, but also to our Christian inheritance. So that was a very important theme for him.
Absolutely. There's this one quote from the preface of How to Be a Conservative from Scruton, which I love, and I think it describes conservatism very well.
That's a great book, by the way.
It is a great book. He writes, conservatism starts from a sentiment that all mature people can readily share, the sentiment that good things are easily destroyed but not easily created. Right? And that's the opposite of that. It takes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet sentiment.
Yeah, that is the great... that's why some people have commented that there's an element of nostalgia in Roger's conservatism, not because he wants to go back like Nietzsche's crabs to some golden age, but because he sees so many good things that have been undermined that didn't have to be undermined. An inheritance has to be preserved and renewed. But when we repudiate it with a vengeance, it becomes very difficult to bring back that which, it wasn't a Hayekian, but there's something to this idea of spontaneous order, that things arise over time. They're not absolutely designed from on top. So even if we had a conservative intellectual cabinet, how are we going to bring this back and bring that? I think we'd be at a loss to know how to do it because these things happen more organically. But when they're destroyed, they can be destroyed all at once.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. If people are interested in seeing more of your work or in following you, where can they find your writing and your work?
Well, I write a piece every month for Liberty and Law. So if you go to Law and Liberty and look under authors Mahoney, you can find 16 or 17 pieces. My most recent book, The Idol of Our Age, How the Religion of Humanity Subverts Christianity, is available in paperback, I think for like $16 from Encounter, so won't cost you much money. I think ISI is re-releasing my 2010 book, The Conservative Foundations of the Liberal Order. My view of conservatism is very close to Roger's, and that will be re-released by ISI Books in paperback in July.
That's great. Well, I will certainly link all those in the show notes. And upcoming on Conservative Conversations, be on the lookout for episodes of Don Devine, the Fund for American Studies, and Sarab Amari of the New York Post. Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select Modern Age articles, ISI books, and of course this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.